Thank you, Gina. Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Mo Chakraborty, and I'm the Director of External Library Services at Salisbury University in Salisbury, Maryland. Today's webinar, Success and Challenges within OER and DEI, is brought together by the Open Education Practices Professional Development Team of the larger ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee, also known as the SLILC. As the co-leader of this team, I want to give a shout out to my other co-leader, Jennifer Shimada, who will introduce herself and go over other housekeeping details in a bit, and my other team members, LaMonica Sanford, Quetzali Barrientos, Lindsay Matz Benson, and Nikat Gauss. I also want to thank the chair and vice chair of SLILC, Meg Mayman and Melissa Malone, respectively, as well as members of the engagement team who have supported and encouraged us to put this event together. Our panel today consists of practitioners who have incorporated OER in their professional workflow. They are Jessica Dye from West Virginia University, Shonda Walker from Georgia College, Kristen Conlin from University of Baltimore, and Ariana Santiago from University of Houston. James Neal, Senior Program Officer at Institute of Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, will provide information about funding opportunities available from IMLS for OER initiatives. I will now turn it over to Jennifer.
Hey everyone, I am Jennifer Shimada. I am the Senior Director of Library and Instructional Media at the Relay Graduate School of Education and co-lead this team with Mo. We are really excited to have these presentations today. So in just a second, we're going to start with the announcement by James Neal and then each of our presenters. During the presentations, we're going to save question and answers to the very end after all of our presentations. And then ask the questions as we go. During the presentations, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'm going to try to keep an eye out on those and record them. But if I miss one at the end, feel free to put it in the end as well. And I'll also try to record if it's for a specific presenter or for everyone. But just wanted to give that context. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but we'll save question and answer to the very end. Feel free to leave comments and such in the chat and make it more interactive. I know that this is a webinar, but definitely makes it feel like more of an audience when there's agreement or things like that in the chat, but we will save questions to the end. So with that, I am going to pass it to James Neal for his announcement.
Thank you so much. I will begin to share my screen and share my slides. Hold on 1 second, please. Okay, I hope that everyone can see my slides. I see nods, so that's great. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, or good evening even. I'm James Neal. I am a Senior Program Officer at the Institute of Museum and Library Services located in Washington, D.C. We're more commonly known as the IMLS. Today's presentation from me will be about 3 to 5 minutes on federal funding opportunities through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You'll see here on this slide that I've included my name, my Twitter handle, as well as my email address. Please feel free to contact me, and I will also be presenting this information at the end of the presentation. But let's jump in. What is the Institute of Museum and Library Services? We are a United States federal government agency. We're what's known as a petite federal agency, meaning that our budget is relatively small in comparison to our sister agencies, and our staff is relatively small with about 70 to 75 people at full-time capacity. We are located in Washington, D.C. We were established in the year 1996. We are the primary source of federal funding for our nation's libraries, archives, and museums. That includes all of the 50 states. in the contiguous US, including Alaska and Hawaii, as well as the freely associated states, such as Puerto Rico, as well as Guam and the Mariana Islands, and a few more. What do we do at the Institute of Museum and Library Services? Primarily, we are a grant-making organization. Through our grants, we're able to facilitate policymaking as well as host convenings related to issues that are priorities for our agency. There are a number of national initiatives and partnerships that we're part of. We also are very much in the business of evaluation, assessment, and measurement. And we do that through our Office of Research and Evaluation. So we provide lots of statistics as well as publications related to library statistics and library data in particular. There are two major grant-making programs in my division, the Office of Discretionary Programs, in which there are opportunities to apply for funding for OER. The first of those is known as NLG, the National Leadership Grants for Library Program. This supports projects that address critical needs of libraries and archives, and we hope to find successful proposals that will yield new models, new tools, research findings, services, practices, or facilitate partnerships and alliances that can be widely used, adapted, and scaled or replicated to extend the leverage and benefits of our federal investment for the digital infrastructure as well as for shared infrastructures. Next is the Laura Bush 21st Century Library Program, or what we more commonly refer to as LB21. This supports the development of a diverse workforce of librarians and archivists in order to meet the information needs of our communities by enhancing the training, pre-professional, and professional development of library and archive professionals. IMLS over the past several years has been strategically funding grants that relate to open educational resources. We all know that textbook affordability is the foundation for a lot of the work that's being done in this area. However, IMLS is also committed to the idea of open education in all of its form and fashions, meaning open science, open data, open pedagogy, and the like. The main idea is unfettered and low-cost access to information and knowledge resources. There have been several recent grants that we've funded across a wide variety of institutional types, including the University of Minnesota's Open Education Network, including the Institute for Knowledge Management in Education, or what we more commonly refer to as ISKME. We also have funded the HBCU South Carolina State University, who held a forum in 2021 focusing on HBCUs and OERs. Perhaps this grant is most relevant to our discussion today. We also have worked with Will Cross at North Carolina State University, who's done great work on scholarly communication, open education, and open infrastructures and open pedagogy. Again, thank you for allowing me to bring these brief remarks. My name is James Neal. My Twitter handle is in this slide as well. My email address is there as well. I'm happy to share these slides with the group after the presentation, but I am presenting to you today to make you aware of funding opportunities for OER grants, and we have a funding opportunity that will be announced in mid to late June, so right around the corner. Please feel free to contact me, and best wishes to everyone. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm next. I'm just orienting my screens because, managing multiple screens is a skill, I think. Okay, so let's see, where am I? Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jessica Dye. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Equity and Open Education Librarian at West Virginia University Libraries. I've titled my presentation OER, DEI, some ideas about reorienting the acronyms that we love so dearly. As you can probably tell from the title of my presentation, I'm pretty informal, and so hopefully this will be a pleasant time that we spend together. This is the first position that I've had that is formally tied to open education work and title, though I've been engaged in open education since around 2016 or 2017. I started in this newly created position last June, and I'm situated within the Office of Curriculum and Instructional Support within our libraries. Our office is responsible for the suite of credit-bearing courses, and part of my job is to provide faculty development and advocacy for open education geared towards instructors at WVU, while other parts of my job are to provide support for librarians around equity-driven approaches to teaching. I hope that context about my workplace and my position might explain some of my approach to this panel, because I'm taking a different approach, I think. As the first panelist, I'm actually going to start us off really broadly talking about OER. First about OER and then about DEI, and then kind of end my portion by identifying some of the ways that we can, and we already do, integrate OER and DEI. As you may already know, some of the early impetus in open education advocacy in academic libraries was focused on the potential for OER to save our students money. This makes a lot of sense because we saw the $300 price tags attached to required textbooks. At the same time that we saw food banks become ubiquitous on campus. We saw the national student loan debt reach more than $1 trillion. We know that costly textbooks are a financial barrier for many of our students. And that's why the IMLS offers those grants, right? Focused on textbook affordability. Similarly, perhaps because most library workers deal with materials like books, we focused on OER. And I specifically mean that we focus on the symbol of the physical or digital object, the OER itself, rather than open education, and really how OER would help us address that financial barrier that students face. So we developed OER positions, we developed OER committees, as well as workshops and panels like this about OER that would help us better address the cost savings aspect of OER or of open education. We also developed OER grant programs that focus on adopting or creating content for high enrollment courses, or creating new content for upper division courses. We've relied on measuring impact or success of our OER programs by the amount of money saved or the number of students reached. In Lambert's 2018 social justice definition of open education, we can clearly identify or categorize this focus on the cost savings potential of OER as a form of redistributive justice. As Lambert notes, redistributive justice, when applied to open education, looks like free educational resources, textbooks, or courses to learners who by circumstance of sociocultural position cannot afford them, particularly learners who are excluded from education, who could be excluded from education or be more likely to fail due to lack of access to learning materials. We are literally reallocating material resources that society fails to provide for those who need them the most. I fully appreciate and value the utility of redistributive justice, but I also do find it somewhat limiting if it's the only social justice principle that we might consider when working within open education. Lambert also offers us two more principles that can provide us with alternate ways about thinking about social justice in open education, and they are recognitive justice and representational justice. And so Lambert describes recognitive justice in open education as sociocultural diversity in the open curriculum. It's the inclusion of images, case studies, and knowledges of women, First Nations people, and whomever is marginalized in any particular national, regional, or learning context. It is the recognition of diverse views and experiences as legitimate within open assignments and feedback. Recognitive justice as a principle can be edifying in helping us situate diversity, equity, and inclusion work in academic libraries. I started paying closer attention to DEI in libraries in 2018 or so. I imagine I'm missing a lot of history, context, and nuance, but from my perspective, this is sort of the trajectory that I've noticed. As a profession, some of us really couldn't ignore the statistics that librarianship has been overwhelmingly white for decades, despite our commitments to diversity and the creation of diversity standards. Many of us read Chris Borg's 2014 blog post about the unbearable whiteness of librarianship that was based on ALA's diversity counts data. Borg challenged us to rethink what value what the value of commitment to diversity is worth when our profession does not reflect our country's racial and ethnic diversity. We know based on the data that libraries are lagging behind in cognitive justice because Black, Indigenous, and people of color have a harder time seeing ourselves in the LIS curricula and LIS workplaces. Many of us are often the only people of color in our libraries. In order to address this cognitive disparity, libraries did a few things. We created diversity committees. We appointed DEI officers to do the diversity work. We also made sure to put pictures of BIPOC on our websites and other marketing materials. We created diversity residencies as well as scholarships and leadership programs for quote unquote underrepresented folks to solve the quote unquote diversity problem. This all sounds really good because diversity is inherently good, right? I'd say not really. I'm not super convinced. I'm actually wary of the ways that institutionalizing DEI can actually bring harm to the social groups who are the most marginalized in our organizations. Though our diversity rhetoric might assume that BIPOC are the beneficiaries of diversity initiatives, in leading on our labor, whiteness and hierarchies of power and work, Brown, Klein, and Mendez-Brady identify the ways that commodifying diversity work can actually perpetuate the hegemonic structures that create the problems we're attempting to fix. For instance, in 2020, I know that many of my colleagues of color at other institutions were expected to serve or lead diversity committees, write diversity statements, and often quickly and after hours, teach our colleagues about anti-racism while providing grace and understanding during a time of extreme grief. Like redistributive justice, I don't think that recognitive justice is enough on its own. I think it's absolutely delightful to see another Asian woman in the workplace, but that doesn't negate the fact that libraries are more likely to put pictures of BIPOC on marketing materials than to promote us to leadership positions when we are just as qualified. Lastly, Lambert's representational justice, when applied to open education, can look like self-determination of marginalized people and groups to speak for themselves and not have their stories told by others. Co-construction of OER texts and resources about learners of color by learners of color, about women's experiences by women, about gay experiences by gay identifying people. Facilitation to ensure quiet and minority views have equal airtime in open online discussions. We can be engaged in, we get engaged in representational justice through open pedagogy most likely, though I think we at large struggle with employing representational justice a lot. Folks who belong to majority groups, whether they are white, abled, cisgender, heterosexual, often think, well, what can I do? There's a problem. How can I help? And I think representational justice is a really good starting point. It's not an end point. If we belong to majority groups in a specific context, we need to find ways to amplify the voices of folks who belong to marginalized groups, who have things to say and respect the things they say and the ways that they say them. As someone who is abled, and I want to make OER and open education at large more accessible, I need to stop and listen to the disability activists who have done the work. I can stop and listen, step aside, find ways to pay them for their labor and expertise as well, right? As we continue to have conversations like these in identifying ways to integrate OER and DEI, here are some ideas that I find helpful. As I noted before, oftentimes diversity is considered a problem that can be solved by ad hoc committees or DEI officers who are charged with addressing it, but oftentimes this actually reproduces the problem and makes social justice additive. I'd like for us to figure out ways to make social justice more integral to open education. One really, really tiny way that I've started doing this is introducing Lambert's social justice definition of open education in my intro workshops. Instead of really just going into like a technical presentation about licenses or how to find OER, I clearly draw paths between OER, open education, and social justice. I'm inspired by folks like Mahabali and Rajiv Janjiani, who ask us to reflect on the value and values of the open education work. Is open education work just about removing those technical and financial barriers through assigning open licenses and measuring cost savings? Bali's chapter, Openness in Whose Interests, critiques the neoliberal and neocolonial rhetoric that frames open as good and benevolent, which is really interesting because it's actually rooted in extractive colonial practices. Bali instead really asks us to make open education a human endeavor. How do we do this? I don't know that we know how, but I think we still have to strive for it. Likewise, Janjiani created his 5 R's for open pedagogy that can drive open pedagogy. And they are respect, reciprocate, risk, reach, and resist. And that is in direct, so I guess it really supplements David Wiley's 5 R's for open content. So instead of just thinking about the licenses, the permissions, and the technical aspects, we're asking about the values. Like John Gianni, when we're building our open education initiatives, we can ask what our values are. I've been inspired by the community-driven approach adopted by the Open Education Conference in 2021. Their values include equity-focused collaboration through care, listening and respect, as well as a culture of vulnerability and humility in both leadership and participation. I think these last two are really rarely found in other strategic visions, and I think they're just delightful. I'm also grateful for folks like Ariana, who's also on this panel, who has partnered with Regina Gong and Cynthia Roscoe to build space for women of color at the Open Education Conference year after year. I think they've done it 2 years in a row. And I think those are really important spaces to have conversations. Additionally, like Bali, I'd like us to figure out ways to resist the neoliberal and white supremacist pressures that we face in our daily work. They often frame the conversations we have, but sometimes we really have to step back and reorient ourselves by reframing the situation and ideating what could be possible. It's not an easy ask, but recognizing the ways that open education is mired in oppressive systems can be illuminating and transformative. Likewise, we can work to think beyond measuring the success of our open education work through cost savings, number of OER created, or students reached, which are very, very important. I'm not saying they're not important, they're very important, but we can also supplement that by identifying ways that we can value care, time, expertise, and labor that actually goes into building equity in open education. And lastly, I think we should pay people for their time, labor, and expertise. I'm running out of time, but I do have a question for you just to think on, and I don't have the answers. I don't think anyone here will solve this, but how do we actually integrate OER and DEI in ways that work to mitigate harm and hegemonic structures? How do we do that in our relationships with faculty, with students, with each other? How do we do that when we create OER? How do we do that in the classroom when we're teaching, working with students to create materials? How do we do that in open publishing? And so thank you for your time. I'll put my email in the chat as well. And I have a bunch of references, but you'll get the slides later. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for that nice setup, Jessica. And if you'll give me just a moment to load my slides. Let's see. Okay, so my name is Chandra Walker. I am at Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. And today I want to talk to you about reframing OER for DEI at Georgia College. So I'll be talking really specifically about some of the work that we've been able to achieve here. And I'm not sure why my slide is not advancing. Okay, so just to offer an abstract, as Jessica mentioned, traditionally the benefits of OERs have centered around the potential cost savings they provide and the financial impact on student success. But in addition to those benefits, OERs have the potential to disrupt the textbook market, amplify the voices of scholars of color, and to recognize the perspectives and contributions of students and faculty. So a little background information about Georgia College. Again, I have the honor of serving as the library director here. Georgia College is a public institution and a member of the University System of Georgia. I've actually worked here for 11 years, first from 2005 to 2007, and again from 2013 to the present. Again, we are Georgia's designated liberal arts college, and we also hold membership in the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges. Our students here at Georgia College have some of the highest GPAs and SAT and AC scores in our 26-member institution system, and many of them come from upper middle class families. Since 2012, our system has offered an initiative called Affordable Learning Georgia. It endeavors to reduce the cost of course materials to students, as well as enhance the discovery of library materials in Galileo, which is our statewide digital library. So our initial success with OERs, to date, through the program, and let me preface what I was going to say with the primary vehicle for the program, Affordable Learning Georgia, is through the dissemination of textbook affordability grants. They offer those at several different price points. They're individual grants or partner grants, as well as department level grants. Here at Georgia College, we've had some success with OERs. We've had a total of 8 projects funded through Affordable Learning Georgia, 2 in the biological sciences, 2 in the mathematical, 1 in business administration, and 1 each in chemistry, English, and history. As Jessica alluded to, a lot of the measurement of success around these initiatives focus on cost savings. So our total cumulative cost savings have been over $635,000. That should not be a dollar sign in front of the total students affected, just shy of 4,000, and the annual savings of $36,194. So we've had some success in these areas with OERs here at the college. Simultaneously, around the time of this initiative began, our institution launched its initial diversity action plan. And I was also just sort of coming on board at that time. And so it was kind of already in motion when I got here. And so I was just kind of very responsive. So the library participated in that plan, and we did it in some of the more traditional ways. So we acquired some new materials for our collections, a couple of databases. We were more intentional about our special collections acquisitions. We acquired the collection of the Honorable Floydell Griffin Jr., who was the first African-American mayor of the city where our college is located. We did some outreach and programming. We had a screening of the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay. We created a video in the library using some archival footage that highlighted GCSU's first African-American graduate. And then we offered some student support to programs that were targeted specifically to underrepresented students. Our Bridge Scholars Program, Call Me Mister, which works with Black men in education, and then our Georgia College Early College. So these 2 things were sort of happening at the same time, but weren't really meeting in the middle. So again, when the program began in 2013, that initial year, we had several grants that were successful in the same year. But over the duration of the program, we have found it challenging to get faculty to respond to calls for participation. And if you think back to my initial background slide, where I mentioned that many of our students come from upper middle class families, textbook costs are not seen as such an urgent concern as they might be on some other types of campuses. So people might feel like, okay, this initiative doesn't really resonate or connect here on our campus. And so we lost some of our momentum. So a couple of questions that I pose for myself, and I serve as the faculty champion for the Affordable Learning Georgia program here on our campus. First was, what other motivations can we present to faculty to encourage OER creation? And then I really wanted to find a more meaningful way to contribute to diversity, equity, and inclusion that would be sustained. So again, nothing really wrong with the programming or the additional resources, but I was looking to see what could we do that could potentially be more impactful and not just, some isolated episodes of programming. So I identified Fraser's social justice framework, which Lambert references in the article that Jessica mentioned, as an appropriate tool to address these questions. I might add here that I've been a practicing librarian for about 20 years now, but I also have a PhD in educational leadership. And so when I was thinking about ways to reach faculty, I was like, okay, what do faculty connect with? Faculty, or some of our faculty, particularly those in the social sciences, they like theory. So I was like, what's the theory? How can I situate this in theory? And so I identified Fraser's social justice framework as a potential theory because of its focus on the redistribution of resources, the recognition of cultural experiences, and representation in political processes. And so I want to talk about those 3 aspects of the theory really quickly, and then sort of wrap up with some recommendations or some observations. So a very familiar pillar of social justice is the concept of redistribution, which my colleague Jessica has already highlighted. I love this quote from Nancy Fraser, She says, for the politics of redistribution, the remedy for injustice is economic restructuring of some sort. This might involve redistributing income, reorganizing the division of labor, democratizing the procedures by which investment decisions are made, or transforming other basic economic structures. So we know that the problem with traditional textbooks is these rising prices, right? As well as textbook monopolies, a few companies just dominating the market. Also, in terms of the division of labor, something that doesn't often get linked back, but I think is really important, is the open access, how our faculty transfer copyright to the publishers whose prices continue to rise. And then being from a public institution, what I find particularly problematic is that we have faculty who are using resources at these public institutions, but then we have to go back and repurchase the intellectual content that was produced here on our campus. So the redistribution part, I feel like we kind of got our hands around that a bit by reducing or eliminating the cost of textbooks through the Affordable Learning Georgia program. I think that is an aspect of Fraser's social justice framework that has been easiest for us to grab. It's got that sort of economic aspect to it that most people can connect to. Again, the whole idea being that if we would reduce the cost of course materials to students and repurpose those materials that we're already buying through our databases, that we tap into this redistribution principle. Now, the recognition point is something that I think there's room for improvement here. And this is a second component of Fraser's framework that I think is relevant for this topic. She says the politics of recognition targets injustices it understands as cultural, which it presumes to be rooted in social patterns of representation, interpretation, and communication. And Lambert sort of situates this within OER by stating that how open is a textbook for marginalized learners if Indigenous, Hispanic, and learners of color are invisible inside the textbook and perhaps invisible in the whole curriculum? And to give you an example of what we unfortunately have seen in the traditional textbook market, I want to offer this example. You may have heard of it. It's nursing, a concept-based approach to learning. And these are some of the examples that were offered in this book. Hispanics may believe that pain is a form of punishment and that suffering must be endured if they are to enter heaven. Jews may be vocal and demanding of assistance, and it just goes on and on. This was actually in a textbook, this third edition of this very popular nursing textbook. And so you really see how necessary this is. Of course, the publisher of this textbook corrected it, but again, the fact that this ever got published in the first place is really problematic. Again, looking at the literature, this issue of recognition applies across disciplines. In sociology, Fitzgerald noted a pattern of avoidance of discussions of white privilege, ahistoricism, and a reliance on the use of passive voice when describing impacts of racism. It was seen in economics. Coachland in 2019 noted a lack of discussion of race or racism in economic texts, a conflation, of racism and discrimination, and so forth and so on. And even in the natural and physical sciences, where you might not expect to see this, research by Lawler and Nyler, as well as Wood and et al., found some very troubling things. Images in 11 popular physics textbooks were less than favorable to women or ethnic minorities. And then Wood et al. Found that white male scientists were most likely to be highlighted in these texts. Women scientists were increasingly represented, but most interestingly, they discovered that while things were getting better in terms of representation of women, it would take multiple centuries at the current rates to reach inclusive representation in these texts. And so there again, you sort of see some of the problems that are inherent in some of these traditional textbooks. So to address that lack of recognition, OERs emerge as a solution. All of us working in higher education should be aware of the rapidly changing demographics of higher education. We know, I think it was ACE between 1996 and 2016, that the non-white share of undergraduates in United States higher education sector grew from 29.6% to 45.2%, while the non-white share of graduate students grew from 20.8% to 32%. Sometimes it's referred to as like the demographic cliff, which I find to be very problematic. But increasingly, the student population of higher education is going to become more diverse. And again, traditional textbooks have the potential to have some of the problems that I've highlighted. And so OERs emerge as an opportunity to present and develop dynamic as well as responsive learning materials. The next point I want to talk about quickly, and I look see I've got about 1 minute left, is this idea of representation. And so this quote reads, and this is from also referencing Fraser's social justice framework: embedded in the social justice commitments making college affordable for all students is a related belief that knowledge should not be an elite domain. Knowledge consumption and knowledge creation are not separate but parallel processes, as knowledge is co-constructed, contextualized, cumulative, iterative, and recursive. I'm going, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through this, but I want to wrap by ending and saying that overall, I hope that what you gathered is that the cost-saving benefits of OERs are important, but they're not the only benefit. Creating OERs that support DEI requires intentionality. And as my colleague Jessica mentioned just before me, an unbalanced approach could potentially preserve the very hegemonies OERs could dismantle. So it can't just be cost savings. It's got to be more than cost savings if we really are to be effective with OERs as they relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you.
Kristen, you're next.
Sorry, I was trying to pull up my my presentation. Thank you. Let me get that presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen Conlin, and I'm from the University of Baltimore's RLB Library. And just like my colleagues Jessica and Chandra had made points about OER reinforcing the structures that we seek to dismantle, I'm going to speak a little bit about that related to OER publishing. So I am a reference and instruction librarian at the University of Baltimore, but I am also the project lead for OER publication, development, and support. And part of the work that I've been doing specifically with OER is related to publishing OER content, as well as supporting the OER publishing process. The scope of the discussion today is talk about the shift in education and the teaching population in academia in general, touch upon Creative Commons and intellectual property policies. And then I'm going to provide some examples from work that has been done at the University of Baltimore and talk about the equity of and the equity in participation. So education is going through a shift now, right? And we have this open education movement, which is an activist movement, as cited by the United Nations. And we're moving from this private for-profit publisher model and content into open education resources. But this not only includes that low-cost, no-cost course materials that we've talked about before, but also this opportunity to create course content that speaks to the unique student population, as well as embrace open pedagogical practices that acknowledge students as intellectual participatory collaborators, and all of the other attributes that have been shared here before this presentation. So with all of this in mind, we shouldn't shy away from reflecting on this movement and critically examining who gets to participate in the open education movement. So if we look at the teaching population with some statistics from a couple of places in our most recent history, in 1993, the AAUMP reported 38% of faculty held part-time positions and 20% were non-tenure track positions. And then moving forward in time to 2018, While this is from a different sample population, the National Center of Education Statistics reported 46% of instructors were part-time. And they clarified here in that instructors included all faculty positions, as well as instructors, lecturers, and staff. And so moving forward, we can see the trend is shifting away from tenured positions as well as faculty positions. But the support structures for those positions have not adapted, and it's retaining an antiquated hierarchy of who gets supported and how much they're supported. So similar to the question that Jessica asked earlier, I want us to take a few moments to reflect on the following. So who teaches on your campus? And then what instructional support is available to them? And if you don't know the answer, just use this time to quickly take a screenshot or write those questions down to investigate later, because the answer impacts the following: OER publishing and Creative Commons. So OER publishing can exist in many forms, but there are some commonalities. OER and Creative Commons are philosophically inclusive and accessible. And publication platforms tend to use WYSIWYG design that creates a low barrier to access for creators. But it's not as simple and positive a situation as we like it to believe, because when we get down below the surface, we start to examine the support structures for OER publication and Creative Commons. And those support structures can be limited, can limit participation based on campus or university barriers. And those barriers can be anything from how course releases are given, what compensation looks like for content development, as well as content development support and publicity of that support. So if you're creating OER on campus, are you reaching out to the staff senate as well as the faculty senate? Are you engaging with adjunct faculty who might not have offices on campus? There's also something to consider too, is the intellectual property policies on campus differ for different positions held. So faculty might have different intellectual property policies than staff, and how that impacts content ownership during the content development process. And so all of this impacts participation in OER creation, as well as the type of Creative Commons licensing that we are able to put on our OER content. So OER at the University of Baltimore started in 2016 and was a grant-funded initiative from the Kirwan Center of Academic Innovation, which is the University System of Maryland's support network for professional development as it impacts instruction. And each year at the University of Baltimore, we have written and successfully been awarded grant dollars for OER. And each year we have attempted to grow our OER outreach on campus, as well as level up our sustainability pledges as we move forward through our OER journey. And we've been reasonably successful with our goals. We've grown from individual instructor adoption to a university-wide interest group that supports large-scale adoption of OER, as well as we are working towards sustainable university support. And READ, this means we want a budget item or a budget line, rather than relying on grant dollars, which are finite. We would like to have OER supported at the university or at the system level. So that investment in OER creation is something that is not seen as temporary and that could be limited based on the platform in which the content is created or published. So throughout all this, the library has partnered with the Center for Excellence in Learning, Teaching, and Technology, CELT, that has supported communities of practice around OER adoption and publication through the involvement of librarians and instructional designers. And as part of the outreach that has been done by the library and CELT, we have been very cognizant of different instructor roles on campus, and therefore our contracts are as inclusive as possible with both language and incentives. So what does that mean? Oh shoot, my other slide's gone. I'll just talk. So inclusive language, this means instead of referring to faculty, refer to instructors. So this allows anyone who is engaging in the teaching and instruction process is able to apply for OER funding and support through the library and SLILC. Inclusive incentives refer to identifying what certain groups, teaching groups on campus need and what incentives would benefit them the most. So currently in our community of practice, we offer compensation through financial benefits, but we are working towards offering the opportunity for contract releases or course releases so that teaching faculty who maybe don't have as much of a financial investment in creating OER, but would value a course release more, would be more likely to participate in OER. It's also in terms of inclusive incentives in terms of the timing of the communities of practice. Staff on campus have 12-month contracts, but when they're teaching, it tends to be in the fall and spring semester. So offering community of practices during the summer allows more staff to participate in OER adoption and creation because their instruction load is less. So all of this has been a growth process. This isn't how we began OER at the University of Baltimore in 2016, but we've evolved over time and are hoping to engage in access to OER creation as well as access to OER as a resource for both creators as well as consumers. So moving forward, what could this look like for anybody who's considering OER publishing on their campus? I advise using a share-alike mindset. So supporting OER by examining your intellectual property policies before you engage in OER, or if you've already started engaging OER, go out and look at those intellectual property policies now, and ask how those policies support Creative Commons licensing and content ownership for all creators. And if you find that those policies favor one status over another, start having discussions with your campus. If that's too big an ask at the get-go, be mindful and aware and be transparent when you're encouraging folks to create or adopt OER, how that could impact their creator ownership and Creative Commons licensing of those works. Provide development, adoption, and publication for all teachers. And this can also include academic support programs. So making sure that all people on campus who are engaged in the education and support of students are being given the opportunity to engage in OER content development and publication. And in a lot of cases, those academic support program OERs could then supplement and then be reused and revised to create course-specific material. It also gives the opportunity for those academic support programs to gain visibility and to demonstrate that the campus values their work as much as they value instructor creation. And then lastly, adopt a share-alike mindset, as well as licenses. So making sure that you are sharing alike with everyone and keeping the OER publishing as open as possible, as well as sharing any content that your campus community creates with others who are seeking to build on the work that you create. So thank you very much. And to keep in touch, here is my email. And I will also share in the chat a newly published article related to intellectual property policies that did a lot to inform my understanding of how that looks like both on our campus as well as how to move forward with that relative to publishing and Creative Commons licenses. Thank you.
All right, I'm next, so I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started in just a second. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ariana Santiago, and I'm the OER coordinator at the University of Houston Libraries. I'm speaking to you today from Houston, Texas, which sits on the unceded land of the Atacapa Ishak, Tappalam, Coahuitican, the Sana Band of the Tonkawa tribe, and Karankawa nations. I encourage us to learn about the land we live on and consider how we can support Indigenous people. To give a little bit of background about myself and where I'm coming from in terms of my work with OER, I'm at the University of Houston, which is an R1 research university with over 47,000 students. And we have one of the most ethnically diverse student populations in the US and have many first-generation students as well. I've been here at UH since 2015, and I've been in my current OER role for about 4 years, starting in 2018, which is when our OER program was formed and launched. And our program kicked off at that time with significant support from the provost, who also provided initial funding for the program. And since then, we've also had funding from the libraries and donors to support OER. So I want to acknowledge the resources I have access to that I feel enable much of the progress we've been able to make here. And overall, I think I get to do a lot of interesting and exciting work, including working directly with faculty to help them find relevant OER, discuss how OER impacts their course structure and pedagogy, as well as create new resources. I also lead the direction of our OER program overall, and so that includes developing and managing incentive programs for OER adoption and creation. So part of my perspective comes from that lens of OER program management. So there's a lot of potential in OER to make higher education more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. First, of course, it removes a barrier to student success, as the cost of textbooks is a real and significant barrier for students. And OER can make the classroom more equitable by enabling all students to have free and immediate access to course materials. OER can also enhance diverse representation in course materials. Textbooks often do a poor job of this, and that's not to say that OER are inherently better at it, but they present the opportunity to diversify material, which can foster a greater sense of belonging for students. And there's an article by Amy Nussbaum that dives deeper into this. Also, several UH faculty have said that they feel that using OER enhances their students' learning because they're better able to incorporate diverse perspectives. And that's coming from faculty who had previously been using a single textbook, and now they have the flexibility to draw upon a variety of sources, often including OER as well as library resources. This quote from a faculty member in the College of Education, I think encapsulates that ability to learn from diverse perspectives. They say that texts from diverse writers offered perspectives that would not be captured in a traditional textbook, and that supported more powerful and meaningful classroom discussions, as students were able to examine points of views they otherwise would not have encountered. And it also elicited input from students who felt more connected to different authors. There's clearly a lot of great potential, though I try not to rest on the idea of OER as an inherent good, because it takes more than just doing OER to be inclusive and equitable about it. One approach to facilitating EDI is to make sure the high-level structures of our OER programs, such as grants or incentives, are inclusive. For example, in my role, I manage 2 incentive programs now, and any instructor of record can participate in these incentive programs, whether they're tenure track, non-tenure track, adjunct, or graduate student instructor. And this gives the opportunity for people at any career stage to be recognized, awarded, and compensated for their efforts to support student success through OER. And speaking of compensation, it is important to compensate instructors for their labor if you're able to. It is a lot of work and takes a lot of time to redesign a course to use OER. And the labor of making OER happen often goes unrecognized. And monetary support for faculty or other types of compensation, as we just heard Kristen talk about, is one way to recognize and honor that labor, I think, even if it's a relatively small amount. And while student savings is definitely an important aspect, we should recognize more than just savings. And I think that's another theme that we've been hearing today. And this is something I'm constantly working on because our program is very much rooted in textbook affordability. So it takes a conscious effort to expand beyond that strong savings focus. One way to do this is in making decisions about which faculty will be selected for incentive programs. When developing our new OER creation program earlier this year, it was an intentional choice to not base the awards off of enrollment and student savings, so that smaller and more niche courses could also have the opportunity to benefit from the support provided through the program. And I'm really grateful for this webinar opportunity because honestly, preparing for it has helped me reflect on questions like, how do I help ensure equity in student materials? How have I successfully incorporated DEI into OER? And what are the challenges and how do I approach those challenges? Here, I've shared some of the overall structural ways that I think can make an OER program more inclusive and equitable. And those questions also come into play when collaborating with faculty who are adopting, adapting, and creating OER. So with that in mind, I'll share a few more themes that I saw in my work related to integrating EDI. So as mentioned earlier, textbooks don't do a great job of representing the diversity of the students who are using the material or of having inclusive content. And OER may not do a great job of that either, right? We could easily end up replicating the same issues. In practice, it's up to the faculty member to evaluate, select, and create their content, but I can play an important role in raising awareness of EDI issues and how OER can be made more inclusive. For example, faculty or instructors may not have a full understanding of open license and the fact that they have the flexibility to adapt the material. So explaining what that means can open up the conversation around things like rewriting parts of a text to be more inclusive or including examples that reflect the history and diversity of their local community. The image you see here is a screenshot of an article by Heather Blicker in which she shares several image repositories that reflect diversity, equity, and inclusion. These include sites like All Go Plus Size, Disabled in Here, the Gender Spectrum Collection, and more. So now, whenever I send faculty information on where to find free or openly licensed images, I've started to make sure I include this list among whatever other options I might share. And after the very first time I did this, the faculty member responded to say how much she loved this particular resource and that she would be using it. So that gives me encouragement that even small actions like sharing this one resource can lead to positive change. Another theme I've observed has to do with accessibility. So sometimes I might hear people talk about OER as being freely accessible resources, when they usually mean that the content can be accessed for free. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's truly accessible for all students, including students with disabilities. So I'm careful about saying freely available when I mean that it's available for free, and saying accessible when I'm talking about accessibility. And so this may seem like a really minor language thing, but I think it's important to distinguish these two terms so that their meanings don't get conflated. If the culture at our institution is to talk about OER as freely accessible resources, then when we want to talk about actual accessibility, there may be a whole other barrier to deal with around understandings of OER access and accessibility. So here we have another situation where it's the faculty member's responsibility to ensure that their course materials are accessible for students. But in our roles supporting the use of OER, we can play an important role in communicating, raising awareness, and sharing resources around this. So this can mean letting faculty know that not all OER they find are going to be fully accessible as is, and that's something they should keep in mind and be evaluating for, as well as the fact that they can adapt the material to be more accessible when the open license allows for it. You might also share some strategies for creating accessible material or direct them to other campus units that can support them in this area. I did a training workshop in the past about modifying and creating OER and included accessibility as one topic within that. So it wasn't a full training on accessibility, but I emphasized that it should be a focus from the beginning of their process and briefly covered a few practices like color contrast, alternative text, and the use of headings. And I also shared some resources. One of the resources I like to share is pictured here. It's the OER Accessibility Toolkit from Open UBC, which I think is a great resource for anyone creating or supporting the creation of OER. And my last theme is around centering student rights and privacy in open pedagogy assignments. And to be completely honest, I haven't done a whole lot around open pedagogy, but on occasion, a faculty member has mentioned that they're thinking about changing up one of their assignments in the future to involve students sharing their work in some way, like maybe through a YouTube video, a blog post, or something else like that. So that's an opening where I can say, oh, that sounds like open pedagogy, and then share resources or have a conversation that helps make sure student privacy is being taken into consideration. One helpful resource is a guide to making open textbooks with students, particularly the list of key questions to consider that you see pictured here. And some of those questions include, can students in your class project choose whether to openly license their work or not? If they do choose an open license, can they choose which license to use? And what if they don't want to be cited and prefer to be anonymous or keep their work private? For a deeper dive into informed open pedagogy, I also highly recommend looking into Cynthia Maria Roscoe's work. Okay, I feel like I've touched on several different topics in a pretty short amount of time, but I think it all boils down to a few overarching questions. How can we ensure OER programs are designed to be inclusive and equitable? How can we support the intentional incorporation of EDI into the adoption, adaptation, and creation of OER materials? And importantly, how can we do all of this with limited human and financial resources, right? Each of us is only one person who can only do so much with the resources that we have. And I hope this panel has helped think about ways to intentionally integrate EDI into our program structures, workflows, and conversations. But I also hope that you keep in mind your boundaries and limitations so that you don't get burned out as well. And so this last question here is one that I feel like I'm constantly coming up against. And I'm sure it's especially felt for those who don't have a designated OER position or don't have money for their OER initiatives. So I think it's really appropriate that James Neal was able to join us at the beginning of this session to share about those funding opportunities from the IMLS that can support OER work. I'm happy to share links to my references. If anyone wants any specific one of those, I can share those in the chat. And that is pretty much all I had. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters for those very informative presentations. We have another half an hour left. And so if anybody has any questions for any or all of our presenters, please feel free to put those into the chat. We'll give a couple minutes to see if anyone has one. Mo, I think you had a question that you wanted to raise up. You want to get us started?
Sure, like while others are thinking of their questions, I just thought like, I wanted to pick your brain, like, because we are trying to, well, I am interested in OER personally, of course. Like, what would be your advice, or maybe one advice to somebody who's just getting started? Like, just like that first conversation with the faculty member.
Any of our presenters can feel free to unmute and share if they have an answer.
I can start us off. I would say that if you're starting off, you don't need to feel like you have to convince everyone to adopt OER. OER are not for everyone. They should always be by choice. And it actually takes a long time to build an OER program, right? You have to build relationships. There's a lot of good literature about like how so much of our labor is in building the relationships with faculty, instructors, staff across campus, so you can make those connections over time. You're not going to get those cost savings measured in a year. It's going to take years. And so I would just say, be kind to yourself. And like Ariana mentioned, think about your boundaries too, right? We have limited human resources, we have limited time and capacity, especially these days. And so be kind to yourself, build community, seek community where you can. And if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, and you want to meet other folks who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color working in libraries, let me know because I can try to connect you. We have a sort of informal chat. So if you want to get in on that, email me.
I would add to Jessica's comments, I think considering the institutional context is really important. As I mentioned in my presentation, we're in a very diverse system of more than 20 institutions that are very different, range from research institutions to access institutions. And so we have a system-wide framework, but how that plays out on the campus varies greatly. So, you know, thinking about rewards and incentives and motivations, particularly with dealing with faculty as it relates to tenure and promotion, you know, how do those things factor into faculty decision making? Here in Georgia, we are in the process of statewide. We've got some new guidelines from our Board of Regents that are going to include student success as a component of promotion and tenure for faculty. And so we are looking at ways the library can position OER as supportive of student success. Certainly the cost savings, but also some of the other components that were mentioned across presenters today. And we're looking forward to starting that here at our institution in the fall from the library. So just really pushing that as a way that we can collaborate with faculty on OERs.
All right, last chance for, oh, go ahead, Ariana.
I was just gonna maybe add on to that. So it was about like getting started and having those conversations with faculty. I definitely agree with everything that's been said, especially what Jessica was saying. I think you were talking about like not everyone has to adopt OER. Like my personal philosophy is like I don't, like if someone has hesitations around it, like people may have concerns or skepticism, and those are usually like very legitimate questions and concerns that are raised. So at that point, it's just like having that conversation is beneficial, even if it doesn't end up with that person adopting OER. So my advice would be like listening, like go with the intent of listening about like what that person's needs are, right? And what are they motivated by, and what do they need for their students in their classroom? And it may be OER, and that's great, but I would start with that as the starting point. Oh, and I put my references in the chat because someone said that they did want those links. So I'm sorry for taking up all of that space in the chat, but those are there if you'd like them.
So that's actually very helpful. Thank you so much, all of you, responding to the question. Do we have any other questions in the chat? Or?
I don't see anything else. So if we don't have any other questions, if you do, please submit those quickly, but I won't hold you up any longer. We do have a survey that I am going to put into the chat. Would love for any feedback on this event or suggestions on future events. Thank you so much to all of the presenters here and for the committee for helping to put this on. We will send out the recording. I will ask presenters for their slides if they are willing to share, and get those sent out through ACRL in the follow-up email. But thank you so much to everyone, and have a great day.